Center, which is in charge of overseeing professional development for all 9,000 graduate students and helping with professional development for 500 postdoctoral scholars at the U of A. I want to welcome you all to the second in our semester-long series of workshops on mental health and wellness. And we're especially happy to have graduate students and postdocs attend, but everybody is welcome. And we're very lucky to have an expert content provider today. I'll introduce her and then I'll turn this over to her. Michelle Rosenbaum she serves as the life management counselor for the A Center. She earned her BA in psychology from the University of Arizona and her master's degree in counseling from Regis University. She's a licensed professional counselor and provides a therapeutic space for students to feel safe, heard, and supported. So we're very fortunate to have Michelle with us and really appreciate your time and expertise, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just so you can all see my PowerPoint. All right, maybe give me a thumbs up and just let me know if you can see my PowerPoint and if you can hear me. Okay, fabulous. If at any point you cannot see my screen or you cannot hear me, just let me know. I'm definitely fine if you want to interrupt for any questions. I will be hopefully answering questions at the end of the presentation, and then I can always connect with anyone offline if you do have any additional information. But thank you again for having me, and thank you to everyone showing up. I do recognize that you all have a lot going on in your day, so I appreciate you taking the time to talk about a topic that I think is so important, and it's something that definitely needs a little bit of airtime. So hopefully we can kind of uncover loneliness and isolation and explore maybe more of what it means for us and the role that it plays, not only now, but also, during the pandemic and moving forward. So again, my name is Michelle Rosenbaum, and I am a mental health counselor. I do work for the A Center. If you're unfamiliar with who the A Center is, we do support students who have not yet selected a major or pre-health and or pre-law. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about adjusting to loneliness and isolation, specifically through the pandemic. We're going to spend some time talking about healthy coping. I will also share some resources, not only here on campus, but also nationwide so that you have access to that information as well. And then we're going to finish up with an activity. Depending on time, again, I do want to make sure that I answer any questions that you all have. So we'll just kind of go see how it plays out with questions and timing, and we'll make it work. So, all right. So I wanted to share this quote by a woman by the name of Elizabeth Gilbert. She's an author of a handful of books that I've read, and I think she presents such an interesting look at loneliness, because oftentimes it's something that is so negative, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. But what I love about this quote is that she essentially is saying, what if you learned your way around loneliness? If you made a map of it, if you sat with it, what would happen? What insight would you gather from it? And how would you use this as you move forward? We may not all be in a situation where we're looking at loneliness from the perspective of a relationship that we place on others, but kind of have this in the back of your mind. What if loneliness wasn't as awful as maybe we think it is? Maybe it is. I don't know. You can tell me at the very end of this all. But think about, maybe there's a way that we can store loneliness in a different place than maybe it is currently today. All right. So according to Psychology Today, 61% of adults over the age of 18 struggle with feeling lonely. So I did break it out based on different types of populations to let you know that right now, those folks who are between the ages of 18 and 22, at least according to a few years ago, they have about 79% of them have related to feeling lonely at some point. Millennials not far behind with 71%, and our baby boomers at 50%. Now, these statistics probably look a little bit different in 2020, but I think it's also hard to get some of that up-to-date knowledge. So again, know that this may change because of the pandemic, but it gives you an idea of about, a good chunk of us, 61%, have felt lonely at some point in our life. So what is loneliness? I asked a few people what were some of the words that came to mind whenever they thought about the term loneliness. And here's what some of them said. They had felt empty, detached, left out, kind of this endless wandering or being unwanted. And this last one always strikes me. It constricts the heart and cripples the body and mind. That's such an image, I think, that sticks with me in particular, because it's something that physiologically we experience, but also cognitively as well. So you may relate to some of these. You may be able to identify some that I did not include. But often when we think about the term loneliness, it's not a pleasant experience. It's actually something that is quite negative and quite alienated for many of us. So what is loneliness? Psychology today defines it as the state of distress or discomfort. It often comes up when we have this gap between this social connection and our desire for it and the actual experiences of it. So oftentimes we could be surrounded by people throughout the day, whether that's because we're in a long-lasting relationship, and yet we still may experience this deep and pervasive loneliness. And I think what happens is it raises this question is why is that? Often we assume that loneliness is because we are just craving that social connection. But what if it's more than that? And I think that's why loneliness is so hard to study and so hard for many people to talk about it, because it's inherently subjective. I know some people who can be by themselves and feel completely rejuvenated, and other people who just can't stand it, and it's something that they try to avoid at all costs. Think about parents who are surrounded by their kids, yet they're away from other different types of adult contacts. Again, the relationship, being away from family. We all have different situations where this may apply to us, but that concept, I think, is really interesting. And part of that fix, I use that term, maybe it's not always about connections, because what if we view our connections as either unhelpful or those relationships are ambivalent to us? Another concept to think about is this social stigma to loneliness. We don't interpret it as a pandemic, and a lot of us are really struggling because we're all socially isolated in many ways. But we often interpret it internally that maybe there's something wrong with us. There's a shortcoming that we have or that we possess. And the question often comes up kind of similar to if someone were to ask you, how are you? I think it's very common to be like, oh, I'm good, how are you? And it's this natural response that we give. So if we were to ask someone if they're lonely, for example, I think a lot of people would deny it and say, no, they're not. But if you turn around and ask that same question just in a different way, asking if someone would like company, for example, they might say yes. So the effects throughout the pandemic, all of you know this, of course, but just reiterating that the pandemic has caused such a shift in our normalcy. Our routines have been disrupted. A lot of our social gatherings and celebrations have been halted or just completely canceled. And it's taking more of an effort to retain relationships or even create new ones. I think a lot of people have gone through that process where at first they were okay, they're getting used to it, and now they're kind of in the lull of things where they're realizing just how much effort it's taking to engage in those social interactions, saying, oh, I'll be fine. But then later on, they feel the effects, for example, of loneliness, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The other item is that it might be hard to determine, is loneliness actually contributing to some of those undesirable emotions or reactions that you're having? Is it loneliness? Is it stress? Is it work-related items or school-related items? It's really hard to tell. And again, it could happen that despite being surrounded by people, you still feel lonely in some ways. So one call out is just populations with increased risk. I think sometimes we forget about this, and knowing this ahead of time may prepare you to tackle things in a different way. or be mindful of people who maybe fall into this category. But know that if you serve in the role as a caregiver, as a frontline worker, if you have your own challenges with either existing medical or mental health conditions, our homeless population, our racial and minority populations, they are all struggling in different ways than the everyday, individual that is also experiencing the pandemic. And that's not to lessen someone else's experience, but just know that those populations have increased risk of loneliness. And the other item I also want to call out is toxicity. So a lot of times when back in March, I think a lot of people said, we're going to go into lockdown, you get to go home, work remotely. I think a lot of people were kind of unsure what to think and maybe even excited initially. But when you think about all the people who don't have a good relationship with those that they live with, and they do have unhealthy characteristics, it makes it even more difficult for that person to really thrive and be in a healthy environment to kind of come back with that resiliency that I'll talk about in a little bit. So mental health impacts, here are some of the items that you may see increase or just look slightly different. It's not uncommon to have suicidal ideations in general. That's something that we talk about often within counseling services, but to have increased suicidal ideation because of loneliness and isolation. You may notice that your depressive symptoms are heightened. You may have diminished willpower to engage in different activities that really require your energy or your motivation, may impact your health and impact your sleep. Now, all of these may be something that happens on a regular basis, but just know that because of the pandemic, it's making things even worse, which is having an impact on our overall well-being. So when we think about loneliness in the brain, do know that chronic loneliness may impact our cognition. So this is our ability to do some of the basic things. You go into a room, remembering why you went in there. What is it that you're reading? Can you comprehend what it is that you just read and kind of regurgitate that into something else? Loneliness can increase the risk of developing dementia by at least 20%, which is substantial. And it also can increase our psychological distress. So we're going to talk about negative thinking in just a few minutes. And then later on, we'll talk about stress and the biological response that we have. One of my colleagues, Jenny, is doing a talk in a few weeks, I want to say, or maybe a month, somewhere around there. But she's going to talk more about stress in the body. So you'll learn more about that if you attend her talk. But know that stress can have a huge impact on our well-being, on our physiological system, and can really impact us. So social isolation, when it comes to research, I do want to preface this and say that, doing presentations for, or doing preparation, I should say, for this presentation, it was really challenging to find different types of research on loneliness because from my perspective, it is something that is so complex and it's something that is really hard to study. So these two items in general, I think are really hard to talk about just because of my own personal opinions about both of them. So I definitely don't want to trigger anyone or offend anyone, but just do know that they are topics that may sit well with you or they may not. The first one is a study that was done back in the 1950s by an individual named Harry Harlow. And what he did is he did some studies with baby monkeys, and they really wanted to look at, what it is that removing them from others would have on their mental well-being. So what they did is they placed some of the baby monkeys in what was called a pit of despair, which was essentially a container that they couldn't climb out of. And they observed them for months upon months. And what they saw is that not having, that contact with other either individuals and or humans really exhibited different forms of mental distress and depression. For those who weren't able to connect with their peers, some of them became angry, hostile, and they even were trying to do a longer study where they were learning about the effects of isolation for up to 12 months. And I want to say that after 6 months, they stopped the study because the results were just truly devastating and debilitating. So again, we are obviously in a very different situation than what happened back in 1950, but I think it does give you an idea as to what can happen when you look at an extreme case of what the effects have for isolation. For humans, looking at solitary confinement, so whenever you are, essentially without any type of meaningful human contact for 22 hours and up, it's not uncommon at times for different inmates to spend months upon months in solitary confinement. There was a study done in 2014 that estimated between 80 and 100,000 inmates. And out of them who are in solitary confinement, about a third of them were either actively psychotic and or acutely suicidal. So if you're not familiar with some of these terms, know that if you're having, actively psychotic symptoms, you may experience hallucinations or paranoia. You may be hypersensitive to certain things. And again, the cognitive area with difficulty with thinking and memory, and having suicidal thoughts that may have not been there before. Your mind takes a different turn when you are in isolation for extended periods of time. So again, both of these are extreme cases, but I think it gives you an insight to the extremes of what could happen to our mental capacity whenever we are isolated for long periods of time. So you're probably asking, what is it that you can do with all this information? Because I know it seems very doom and gloom, and a lot of times it feels that way. I can 100% relate to that. So one thing that you can do is really think about the role that control plays. We talk about control as far as what I have control over and what I don't have control over. And one thing that has been heightened is what I call our inner critic. So the pandemic has been nice in some ways, that maybe it's given us more time back with family, friends, ourselves. But the downside of that is that a lot of people have told me that they have more time to think. And sometimes they seem to be overwhelmed. It's almost as if our thoughts have been hijacked in a way. And that inner critic, that voice that we have, has sort of been turned up to a really high volume. So if you've ever been trying to sleep and for whatever reason you're replaying the day, you're thinking about whatever it is that you need to complete, you may experience different forms of trauma reminders or other racing thoughts. That's oftentimes similar to what we may experience whenever that inner critic is activated. So oftentimes it is a voice of criticism. It can undermine us. And oftentimes we leave feeling really insecure or unwanted. Some of the messages that come up may be that, we're pathetic, we're useless, we should really deal with this on our own. And the question that I ask is, if you have ever noticed that this happens for you, to really pay attention to, when do these thoughts occur? Is it during a particular time? Is it following maybe an event that didn't go according to plan? And what is it that they do? Is it a thought that just sticks around, or does it actually elicit some type of behavior? So one suggestion that you can do, again, to manage your inner critic, it's probably something that you're never going to fully escape. It's always going to be there, just like loneliness is going to always be there, but it's figuring out how to manage it when it does become heightened and it becomes overwhelming. So with our inner critic, one thing that you can do is you can change the way that you think about that particular message that the inner critic is telling you. So for example, instead of saying, I am stupid, I can change it to the second person that says, you are stupid. And even though that is still a negative statement, what I'm doing is I'm depersonalizing it. When I do that, I can then work with it a little bit differently. So oftentimes when I'm working with individuals, I always ask them to counter that particular thought. So one of my favorite questions is, where is the evidence? So essentially I am asking, where is the evidence that supports that you are stupid? Now, I could do really bad on a test, for example, but does that mean that I'm stupid? Or does that mean that I just didn't do really well on that particular test? So when I use my logic and asking where is the evidence, I'm managing the emotion that feels really, really overwhelming. And for me, a person who I feel like lives in a sea of emotion, it helps me to kind of find this balance that I am working with more of that logical part of my brain. When I do that, I can then explore any behaviors that I'm trying to avoid. So, for example, another drink won't hurt. Well, maybe that might be true in many ways, depending on a person and their own unique situation. But I know for me, if I were to have another drink, it's because I don't want to think about something. I'm avoiding something. If I tell myself, don't bother getting out of bed, maybe there's something that I don't want to do or some conversation that I don't want to have. That's where my behaviors kind of come into play. That may look a little bit different for you, but those are just some examples to kind of get you thinking about what does your inner critic say and what effect does that have potentially on your own personal behavior. So again, it's exploring the thoughts and opinions versus the facts. So one question that I ask is, can we identify a growth opportunity from our loneliness experience? Again, I'm definitely not saying that loneliness should always be a great thing, but similar to that quote that I shared at the beginning of the presentation, is it possible that maybe similar to physical pain, it's kind of our body's way of reminding us that maybe we need something. Maybe that is a connection, maybe that is a new opportunity, maybe there is something that I need to tap into that I've been avoiding. So it could be a way that it's trying to tell us, how do we look essentially holistically at ourselves to see what is off and what it is that I might be able to do differently. So with that in mind, I am going to share some healthy coping techniques to help you manage loneliness. Again, I know I've said this before, but I am going to repeat it just because I think it's so healthy, that you will not walk out of 2020 being a brand new person. And I hope that in some degrees you don't think that that is the expectation, because if you are just, surviving and you are managing every day, in my personal book, like, you are doing really well. But I do think that we can always learn more ways to effectively and healthfully cope. As I'm making up new words, it works for me. So hopefully y'all can just roll with it. So for you all being students, I think it's really helpful to think about the academic connections. So what is it that you can do from an academic point of view? Maybe that's taking advantage of some office hours, even though I know some of them are offered at kind of ridiculous times. I've heard a few students talk about it being like very, very early in the morning. So it may require you to get up early. But you never know, that knowledge sharing can be super powerful. And it may even lead to potential connections, either with internships, jobs. You never know what could happen from it. So don't rule them out as, something that you don't need to take part of. Maybe attend events that are suggested by your professors or your educators. There are some professors who have recommended some really good books or podcasts to check out, and some of them you might actually like. So, explore some of those recommendations that are shared with you. Get social. So the one thing I tell people is that if your best friend, your boyfriend, girlfriend, whomever that may be, would just show up at your door, I mean, darn, that would be really great. And I wish that could happen. But the reality of it is that we do have to, again, either nurture the relationships that we have, or we have to put in that energy and effort to create those new relationships. So is it the same as meeting someone in person? Absolutely not. But there are ways that you can connect with your family and friends through phone calls, social media. I've seen a handful of groups kind of do games through Zoom, which seems really weird of how you would actually do that, but it works out really well depending on the game. You can talk to those that you feel comfortable with and tell them how you're actually feeling. So I put that to kind of highlight, because again, similar to, hey, how are you? I'm good. How are you? That conversation, I think we get into this routine of just sharing that we're good when maybe we're actually not. So feel free to share how you're actually feeling. And if you kind of question whether someone is actually good and their behaviors maybe don't align with that, if you feel comfortable, maybe ask them, hey, is something going on? You don't seem yourself, maybe we could talk about this or that, see if they're open to that if you're talking with someone else and happen to notice those traits. There are a lot of virtual and in-person support groups. I'll do a little plug later for a group called Rise and share some more information if that's something that you're interested in. Can of course talk to you more about counseling services, and I'll share some of those resources that are available on campus. And again, maybe there's some really cool hobbies that you might be able to take part of, cooking, whatever that may be. Find ways that you can check in with your friends, your colleagues, not necessarily to prove that you did it, but more to just have that sense of achievement. It may indirectly help with accountability, but again, maybe it's just like, hey, I have something fun to share, and normally I don't. So it's kind of cool that I do, and I can take a few minutes to tell you all about it. And that's kind of a nice thing to experience. And then get out in nature. We live in a state, even though those who know me will know that I really don't like the desert in so many ways, but at 6 a.m., it's actually quite lovely outside. And, for every person who loves the hot weather or the cooler weather, right now you can find a time that works best for you. And again, don't take it as a failure if you don't leave 2020 with a new hobby or a new skill. Like, again, the fact that you're just getting through every day, you get a gold star in my book. So sleep hygiene, you all have probably heard about this 1,000 different times, but if I had to give you, at least 5 things to walk away with, sleep hygiene would definitely be one of them. So again, going to bed at a similar time, making sure that you're removing technology. You can engage in different types of mindfulness or meditation. There are some apps that I personally use. I have Calm, I have Headspace, an Insight Timer. They do have free options for all of those, but even YouTube has some really great guided meditation that you can take part of. My shower metaphor, so you don't physically have to be in the shower to utilize this, but what I like about this metaphor is that when you're in the shower and you're washing your hair, washing your body, it's nice to see the soap or whatever it is that you're using, body wash, kind of roll through different parts of your body and then roll out through the train. So I kind of do the same thing with my day. I do a recap of what happened, what was well, what didn't go so well, and the things that I really don't have control over. I almost imagine them kind of going down the drain the same way that soap would. If I can replay a situation 1,000 times, but if I can't do anything about how I reacted or responded, I can maybe come up with a plan moving forward, but I can't go back in time. So sometimes it can be a very powerful experience to kind of let the day go, see it wash out the drain, and kind of start, the next day with a fresh slate. The other thing that I would suggest is, sitting with our emotions. I know this sounds like a very simplistic request, and it's really not. So I've included some things to think of to focus on and maybe some things to not focus on. So with our emotions, it is helpful to acknowledge the emotion and acknowledge the situation. So for example, talking about loneliness, again, it's not uncommon to have thoughts and feelings about loneliness. That's very, very normal. And to recognize that, what would it look like if I didn't judge myself for being lonely, for being sad, for being anxious, and to really just sit with that physical sensation. I am a person that there are certain situations where physically I may feel a certain type of sensation before cognitively I may be aware of it. So if that happens to be you and you're sitting there and you feel, tension in your chest or your stomach is feeling really tight, maybe tap into that and see, what is that saying? I had a phenomenology teacher in grad school, and I actually did a paper on loneliness, and him and I would talk about well, what is loneliness saying? And at the time, I totally thought he was off of his rocker. But now looking back at it, I was like, yeah, that's a really good question. What is loneliness saying? And to sit there and to not judge whatever, may be coming up, I think is a really beautiful experience. Some things to keep in mind of maybe being mindful of not doing would be reacting immediately. Sometimes we may label the emotion as either good or bad, push it away, push it down, tell yourself to kind of suck it up, move on. Um, I'm guilty of confusing my feelings for facts. So maybe not just again jumping to that assumption and really just sitting with it and see, is it possible that a month from now, 5 years from now, is this really going to matter the same way that it does today? And sometimes the answer may be yes, but sometimes the answer may be no. So just some things to think about as you sit with your emotions. One item to think about is this concept called RAIN. So this acronym that you can remember. This was by an individual by the name of Tara Brach, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she is a clinical psychologist. She's also a teacher of mindfulness and meditation. And she talked about different ways to sit with your emotions. So using that RAIN metaphor to really explore like what is happening, to allow the experience to be really just there, not judging it for, again, good or bad, exploring really why it's there, but doing so with care and with interest and nurturing yourself with self-compassion. So again, if RAIN is something that is easy for you to remember, that may be something to think about as you try to sit there with your emotions, because if you have never done it before, it can be a little bit weird and awkward until you get more comfortable with it. So gratitude, you may have heard this in different areas, and we're going to talk about gratitude a little bit later, but embracing gratitude can actually retrain your brain and form new pathways that can identify, that joy and that light that oftentimes we have whenever we are doing an activity that we're so grateful for. So even just identifying 3 to 5 things, they don't have to be magnificent in scope. They can just be everyday basic things. Maybe you're grateful for coffee or for colleagues that are supportive. I'm grateful that I can move and I can walk, the basic things that, we often take for granted. The question that I also love is, instead of thinking about what you're missing out on, so sometimes we refer to it as like, FOMO, it might be more thinking about, what are you able to experience despite everything that's going on? Is there something that you are enjoying? Maybe that's getting some more sleep, spending time with your furry animals, or, being able to catch the news when normally you would be at work. So again, those different types of situations that you might be able to take part of. And then journaling, meditation, mindfulness. We are going to do a journaling activity at the end just to kind of give you a little bit of insight into what that may look like. So health and movement, I say movement instead of exercise because I think a lot of people kind of have a negative experience with exercise. And the one thing I tell people is that, we're all not training to be American Ninja Warriors. So know that movement is something that you can do, whether that's dancing, stretching, yoga, going on a walk, running, whatever your passion is, make sure that you're moving in some capacity. The World Health Organization talked about social isolation and said that it can be as damaging to our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which when I read that, it was just kind of mind-blowing for me that that could actually, happen just, again, being isolated. But as I did some of that research with those 2 studies, obviously it can impact our health in many, many ways. So again, stress can definitely increase our cortisol levels and can really impact just our medical well-being. So our increased risk for heart disease and high blood pressure. It may decrease our lifespan and, of course, decrease our immunity, which during the pandemic is probably the last thing that we all need. So again, movement looks different for everyone. Move in some capacity based on what you're able to fuel your body with nourishing foods and get, cardio. The recommendation is at least 3 times a week for adults. So here are some other coping strategies. Oftentimes people will say, well, I don't know what to do, or I can't think of anything. So here are some suggestions. Breathing exercises are always great. And not just breathing like we do every day, but actually really taking deep breaths and doing more diaphragm breathing versus like chest breathing. Reading, music, laughter, games. making sure that we're managing our time. Grad school is not easy. Like anyone who tells you that, I think is so full of it. So know that it's really hard to get, motivated sometimes. So the more that you can manage your time and get into those healthy strategies, the better. I'm also not going to tell you what to do and what not to do when it comes to some types of riskier behaviors. So know that just obviously alcohol, drugs, other type of risky behaviors as far as like promiscuity or, just doing things that you maybe wouldn't normally do, proceed with caution. Do whatever is best for you, but just know that they can have an impact on your overall well-being. So one activity that I will tell you about before we talk about some of our resources and then go into our activity. So grounding is something that we can do to really get more in touch with our body. And I think about grounding from our 5 senses. So there are 2 ways that you can do this. If you happen to be, in a room where you have access to, certain items, you can look around your current space. So one thing that I will often tell people is, identify things that you can see. And sometimes I will have them be specific. So tell me everything in your current room, for example, that is purple. So you really have to look around your current space and identify everything that is a particular color. And this example being purple. The other thing that you can do is pick out shapes. So if I had to identify what is circular, for example, I could pick out random things from different areas on my computer to drawer knob handles, door handles that have circular items. So I really have to focus on things that are in my area. And the purpose of doing something is that when I'm doing that, I'm oftentimes not able to think about whatever my inner critic is saying or whatever kind of overwhelming negative thought. I'm truly just focusing on the task at hand. So know that you can do this with different items that you have access to. You can focus on what you're hearing, describing things that you can touch. And again, it's not necessarily just saying, well, I'm like sitting on this chair. Well, tell me about it. What do you think it looks like? How would you describe it to someone who maybe isn't here? What does the texture feel like? And I put the cactus up there just because obviously you do want to make sure that you're respecting someone else's boundaries if they happen to be in the room with you and you're getting permission to touch anything that they may be sitting on, obviously, and so on. The other thing that you can do is more of a imagery. So I always use the example of the beach just because for me, the ocean is something that is so just magical and very, very relaxing. So with an imagery, I can actually transport myself to this location. The only thing that I tell people is that you should envision a place that is safe and secure and that is, free as much as possible of any type of trauma, reminders, triggers, anything along those lines. But if I were to picture the ocean, I can tell you what the ocean looks like and not just say, well, there's water. Well, obviously, but how would I describe the water? What is the color? Is it calm? Is it, kind of rushing in? All of those details. I can tell you that the sun may be on my skin and explain what that may feel like. What would the air smell like? Maybe there happens to be taffy that's being made or things that I can taste. So again, you can get very creative and kind of explore some of those areas from a visual point of view as well. So some resources, again, I mentioned that I would share about Wildcats Rise. So if you are not familiar, RISE stands for Resilience in Stressful Events. And it is a model that is based off of psychological first aid. So PFA is the acronym. It is not group therapy. The people who are running the group are not clinical therapists. They are trained in PFA. So it is not technically a group therapy. It's more of an outlet to share different types of stressors and talk about healthy coping. One nice thing for all of you is that there is a specific option for graduate students. So I think it can be helpful to talk with other students who are also going through maybe similar challenges that they can kind of talk more about and relate to. Yeah, and thank you for including the link to RISE. I appreciate that. Here are some mental health resources on campus. If you are familiar with all of these, bravo to you. I think that's so exciting. In all honesty, when I looked at this list, I did not know that all of these services exist. So I will attach a PDF at the end so that you have access to this. And I'll also share this slide deck if you do want to, kind of look at some of these resources more. But do know that there are resources on campus if you yourself are interested in talking with someone more about your own mental health needs. Here are some other wellness resources. They have some great ones. When we think about wellness, we often think about sleep, or we think about, maybe nutrition. But I think it's also important to make sure that we're talking about wellness and we're talking about our sexual health, our mental health. So here's just some great internal websites you can take a look at and explore some of the options that they have listed out so lovely. Here are some local national mental health resources. Again, if you're not familiar, some of these you can text, some of them you can call. The Crisis Response Center is actually here in Tucson, so it's off of Ajo by Banner South. Yeah, so if you ever need to utilize that resource, I can tell you more about it if you have any specific questions. The community-wide crisis line is something that's available 24/7. And then our warm line, you can talk with a trained professional and they can talk to you if you're ever feeling overwhelmed or you just need some support in that moment, but maybe you don't have anyone else who you might be able to reach out to. They are a great support to connect with. Okay, so I was kind of rushing through that a little bit because I know that we are just getting close on time. So if you are interested in working on this activity, it's not too long. The only thing that I ask is that you can get out a maybe pen or pencil and a piece of paper. We're going to do a quick journal activity. So I'm going to read a few questions to you all. You can respond to the questions, and then at the end, I might invite anyone who would like to share, or just kind of talk about what the experience was like for everyone. So I'll give everyone just a few seconds to kind of gather something, and then I will go ahead and get started. Okay. So if you're not ready, that's okay. You can join at any time. But the first question is, how are you feeling right now? Maybe list out a few words that come to mind if you think about just emotionally how you're doing right now. And if you think about some of those emotions, think about either the feeling that you have. So for example, maybe depression is something that you experience and you notice that it makes people leave you alone. Think about how those emotions may serve you. Do they allow you to express yourself? Are they limiting in some way? Maybe they're comforting or familiar. So kind of jot down some feelings about what those emotions do for you. Next, I'm going to have you write down 3 fixed beliefs that are negative that you have about yourself. So for example, one of them is, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm ugly. Those are some examples. So 3 fixed beliefs that are negative. And then once you're done with that, identify 3 truths to challenge those negative fixed beliefs. So, for example, if I said previously that I'm not good enough, one that I might use to counter that would be I am enough. Then, if you can, identify something that you are proud of. This could be something that happened recently or maybe even a while back, but something that you are proud of. Next, you can write out a time where you feel your best. Maybe this is by yourself or with a certain person doing something in particular. But when do you feel your best? And then, similar to our earlier conversation about gratitude, what are 3 things that you are grateful for? And what is something that you need to say no to? Might be people asking you to do things that you don't have enough time on your plate for, maybe something unrelated to school, but what's something that you need to say no to? Just the opposite, of course, of that question. What is something that you need to say yes to? Maybe there are new experiences or something that you want to do different that you've been thinking about but haven't committed to. What's something you need to say yes to? And finally, what is something that you need to let go of that is no longer serving you? So, something to let go of that is no longer serving you. So, when you are done, I encourage you just to sit there maybe for a minute And just really take some deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. You may put your hand onto your belly and kind of feel it going up and feel it going down. But take a few moments just to focus on your breathing. When you get to a good place, you can just kind of check in with yourself to see how you're feeling. If you want, there are some people who love to get that piece of paper and rip it up and tear it into 1,000 different pieces. You can crumple it, or you can use it as something that you may reference and kind of look at through later on this evening. So I do know that we have a little bit of time left. I did want to open it up just to see if anyone had any questions. I am going to put a resource in the chat so that everyone has access to it in regards to some of those items on campus that you can reference as far as mental health related items. But if there are questions that you have, I definitely can, answer any type of mental health related questions. Otherwise, I will make sure and share the PowerPoint with David so that he has access to that and he can send it out to you later. But if you don't have any questions, I genuinely do appreciate all of your time and hope that this was helpful for you all.
Thanks, Michelle. We really appreciate your time here today. Everyone, if you would like to submit your questions in the chat, if you feel more comfortable with me reading them, I'm happy to do that. You're also welcome to use the raise hand feature in the participants section of Zoom to let us know that you'd like to ask your question. And you can unmute yourself after we see that.
No pressure too. I know sometimes it's so hard when people ask if you have questions. So if you don't have any questions, that's totally fine. I'll give my email address to David, and you can always reach out to me if you do have questions either about counseling, you just want to know more information about services that are available. But if you don't, that's totally fine too. So.
Well, I have one for you regarding the journaling activity. Is there a, assuming that activity is what's, what someone like finds really useful, how often do you recommend people do that activity, sort of the way you guided us through it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that can be used really at any point in time. Sometimes if I'm having a rough day and I'm really struggling with something, I'll do more of a kind of fixed journaling activity, so specific questions, just to get me, able to participate in something, but I'm not spending a lot of time, thinking of questions and, what should I do, what should I not do? It's just there. Other times, if I'm struggling and I kind of don't really feel like doing a guided activity like that, I'll do something called free association. So I'll typically put a timer on my phone for like maybe 5-10 minutes, and I'll just do a data dump of everything in my headspace and just write it down. Doesn't matter if it's spelled correctly, if it's a complete sentence, just to get everything out and to give what is in my head some airtime. And what I'll do is I'll take that and I'll kind of look at it and see, are there any themes that I might be able to take from this? What exactly is sort of going on for me in this moment? And I might recognize again some of those items that, maybe I'm kind of negative about this particular thing, or I'm really angry. Maybe I'm happy about this, but I'm stressed about this. So depending on what you do, it's really like no particular timing. It's just whenever you feel like you could benefit from taking a moment to really just get into a calm state of mind.
Cool. Those are all really good points. And I hope everyone that's attended today will take them into account, especially if the journaling activity was really good for them. I guess I have a follow-up question, not related to journaling, but sort of related to this online environment we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And how are there tools that you've found have been really helpful for people that, like clients you've worked with and students you've interacted with, that have helped build that community in an online venue?
Tools, not so much. I would say that a lot of students have a hard time reaching out to, other individuals. So know that, again, if they would just show up at your door, I think that would be amazing. But it does take that energy to kind of reach out. I think some people feel more comfortable reaching out through a chat or, a message in some way instead of having that in-person interaction. So in some ways, it can actually benefit that particular preference. Um, I would say that it's just really making it personal, even though it feels very informal at times, it can also still be very connected and be a really, emotionally rich experience despite it being virtual. So I think if you're open to it and, you decide, okay, what can make this experience a little bit better? Should I ask a question? Should I get clarity? Um, can I make this fun in some way so that it doesn't have to be so boring? Just finding out whatever those tips are so that it makes it a little bit more enjoyable.
Thank you. We did have a question come in, and it's regarding sort of different services on campus. It says, the writer was wondering for the on-campus counseling services. They believe some graduate students might get clinical hours through working at those places. Are there options if we aren't comfortable working with someone at a similar age/time and schooling as us? I don't want to offend anyone who may be in the program, so I thought I could ask this anonymously.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think it's really hard too when you're in grad school to work with your peers. I would say that, at most sites, I can't speak to U of A just because I didn't do my graduate program at U of A, I did it elsewhere. But I always had a clinical support. So they would probably be my go-to person that I would ask some of those questions with. Do I have an option to say no based off of XYZ, whatever my preferences are, whatever my concerns are, and to kind of see what that would be like. If you don't want to work with someone because they are, similar in age, I think my one caution I would say is that you may find later on in your career, depending on whatever route you go, that you may have to work with someone else who is your age or who is someone who is going through maybe a similar experience to you. And I would say that you have to figure out if that would impede, your clinical judgment, your morals, your values, your beliefs, or if there's a way that you can kind of work through that and see, is it good now to kind of get that experience and see, okay, in a learning environment, what are things that I should be cautious of? What are things I should avoid? And really use it as a teaching opportunity. So it would really tap into your mentors, your clinical supports to kind of get that judgment. If you are solely doing it just because, you may be afraid or scared, I would tap into that too and know that that's super common. From a counseling perspective, I can't tell you how many countless hours I had to, do therapy with someone who I didn't want to do anything to cause any type of harm or damage to them. And it was terrifying. And being on video and having people critique you. So, see whatever it is that makes you feel good, but get the clinical judgment and supervision so that you're being ethical in your morals and you're aligning with whatever makes the most sense for you too.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Well, I think we are right at the hour mark.
Okay.
So I'm going to drop into the chat a short survey link. And for those of you still on the line, please let us know your thoughts about how this session went. But in the meantime, I really want to thank Michelle again for being here today and for helping us better understand loneliness and isolation, especially in the environment of the pandemic, and how we can move forward with dealing with feeling lonely and isolated. And I hope all of you here on the call today felt like you learned something and you have something tangible that you can try out after this session. So with that, again, thank you so much for being here, Michelle. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you again for everyone for showing up and taking time out of your day. And if you do have questions, just please reach out and I'm happy to answer them. So
great.